did not know, didn't have a safety. I didn't know any of that. That's what I do. I'm trained to do that. Okay? Trained to kill. Okay? Trained to kill. That's what I do. But trained to kill. I'm trained to kill. That's what I do. Trained to kill. Okay? That's what I do. Kill. For a living. Okay? Anything that I trained to kill. Okay? It hurts. It hurts the people that I care about. Okay? Yes.
So let's look at what exactly dissociative identity disorder is. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID, is a rare disorder associated with severe behavioral health symptoms. DID was previously known as multiple personality disorder, or MPD, until 1994. Approximately 1.5% of the population internationally has been diagnosed with DID. It is typically associated with severe childhood trauma and abuse. Patients may spend up to 5 to 12.5 years in treatment before being diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. The DID person, per the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, is described as a person who experiences separate identities that function independently and are autonomous of each other. The International Society describes alternate identities, or alters, as independent identities with distinct behaviors and memories distinct from others, and may even differ in language and expression used. Signs of a switch to an altered state include trance-like behavior, eye blinking, eye rolling, and changes in posture. Now let's look at the other side. Pseudogenic dissociative identity disorder. Unfortunately, pseudogenic, non-genuine, DID, is more common than many might wish to believe. Before anything is said about the rates of pseudogenic DID, the overall rates of factitious, lie, or malingered, fake or exaggerate, disorders should be considered. The rates of malingering have been estimated to range from 7% in non-forensic settings to 17% in forensic settings. Factitious disorders are thought to have a prevalence of 0.5 to 6% within the overall population and affect approximately 1% of individuals within hospital settings, though some studies have placed their prevalence in tertiary care settings, such as specialized treatment for cancer, at 9%. Regarding psychiatric health, factitious disorders are thought to account for 0.5% of psychiatric hospital admissions, 6.4% of psychotic disorders in individuals who are inpatient, and 2 to 10% of dissociative disorders in individuals who are inpatient. Overall, factitious dissociative disorders are thought to account for 2 to 14% of all presentations of dissociative disorders, with higher rates being found within specialty dissociative disorder units and within referrals to expert consultants. One study found that 10% of admissions to a dissociative disorders clinic had either factitious or malingered DID. Not only are there now more individuals who feign DID than there have been in the past, these feigners are more sophisticated in their presentation because they can make use of publicly accessible sources of information regarding the disorder, including personal accounts of life with the disorder, media portrayals, and general information online. In 1987, Richard Clough commented that it was fairly easy to distinguish between those who genuinely had DID and those who were simulating DID because the latter group had insufficient knowledge to fully mimic the disorder. By 1991, simulators had become more sophisticated, making recognizing them more difficult and time-consuming and requiring more of an expert background. Those with feigned DID and genuine DID are similar in terms of demographics and in many of their claims regarding their symptoms and supposed alters. So to the layperson, they might be almost impossible to casually distinguish. Additionally, factitious disorders in general are thought to be growing increasingly common online, where potential victims to the feigner's story are likely to have little ability to detect feigning and are more likely to suspend their disbelief in the absence of the cues of lying that are present only in face-to-face interactions. However, there are potential red flags that can be noticed across a variety of settings that can indicate that an individual may be faking DID. These red flags regard openness about the disorder and one's traumatic history, continuity of memory, affect tolerance, reporting abuse that is inconsistent with one's medical history, a lack of comorbid post-traumatic stress disorder, trying to prove that one has the desired diagnosis, and dramatic, stereotypical, or bizarre symptoms. General indicators of factitious disorder and malingering also serve as indications that an individual may be feigning DID. These include labile indifference, exaggeration, persistent lying, pseudologia fantastica, selective amnesia, lack of consistent work history, refusal of collateral interviews, legal problems, and excessively dramatic behavior, as well as lack of prior dissociation, and the individual seeking hospitalization or a DID diagnosis. Finally, potential indications that one may be feigning DID include a need to assume a sick role, medico-legal motivation to be labeled as having DID, demanding or depreciating attitudes towards caregivers, a lack of previous psychiatric history, inconsistencies within symptoms, numerous hospitalizations, lack of observed symptoms or worsening of symptoms while under observation, or refusing psychological testing. Genuine individuals with DID usually feel ashamed of their diagnosis and genuinely suffer from their symptoms. Features that are often absent in feigners. While individuals with pseudogenic DID may not display all of these warning signs, and while individuals with genuine DID may display a warning sign or two over time, An individual who displays a large number of these warning signs should be examined very carefully. Some diagnostic instruments that are used to confirm that an individual has DID contain scales to assess for malingering or other forms of dissimulation. The Structured Clinical Interview, or SCID-D, is one such instrument that does well at differentiating between genuine and feigned DID. On the other hand, the Dissociative Experiences Scale, the DES, which is meant to be more of a screening tool, fails to distinguish between genuine and feigned DID, though inconsistencies between an individual's DES score and their behavior during a structured interview or during therapy can be meaningful. In addition, the Multidimensional Inventory of Dissociation, or MID, should not generally be used as a measure of malingering because its validity scales seek to highlight response bias, not invalid responding. Its rare symptoms scale can indicate deliberate false endorsement of items, but 8% of individuals with genuine DID will endorse a clinically significant number of rare symptoms, so this scale alone cannot be taken as a sign of pseudogenic DID. Similarly, the factitious behavior scale of the MID is more of a measure of a type of severe borderline pathology than a feigned DID, and 10% of individuals with DID will reach clinically significant levels on it. Many instruments that are deliberately created to detect feigning are similarly unable to distinguish between genuine and pseudogenic DID. For example, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, MMPI-2, has been shown to be incapable of this task, despite its ability to detect malingered PTSD. And the Structured Interview of Reported Symptoms, SIRS, also returns poorer results for DID than it does for other disorders. Though rarely used for this purpose, there are tests that explicitly highlight malingered amnesia, and so could potentially be used to indicate pseudogenic DID. These include the Portland Digit Recognition Test, PDRT, a two-alternative test based on what is known regarding a crime committed by an individual who claims to be amnesiac of it, possibly because of alter activity. The test of malingered memory, TOMM, the Ray 15-item memory test, and the Ray auditory verbal learning test. It should be noted that these tests could not be used to test inter-identity amnesia because it's known that some memory transfer occurs between alters. Instead, these tests measure respondents' attempts to give a profile of amnesia within the tests that does not actually match the profiles of individuals with genuine amnesia. In other words, they do not measure genuine amnesia, but only attempts to feign amnesia. Some of the difficulties of distinguishing feigned from genuine DID exist because some individuals with DID do present in a highly dramatic manner that would usually be taken as an indication of faking. Individuals with DID might also exhibit antisocial features, factitious histories, factitious alternate identities, malingering, and factitious medical symptoms, And those in forensic settings may exaggerate symptoms in the hopes of being exculpated on psychiatric grounds. DID may be malingered for the same reasons that PTSD is malingered, including disability benefits, financial settlements, and being found not guilty of crimes by reasons of insanity, or for more specific reasons such as having an excuse to behave aggressively, erratically, or selfishly as a way to justify a pathological relationship, or as a way to claim entitlement. Individuals who simulate DID may attempt to use their alters to avoid negative repercussions for their actions and may appear to be compensating for a feeling of not being seen. Factitious disorder may be associated with characteristics of borderline personality disorder, with a poorly developed sense of self and with reenactment of childhood trauma. In some cases, individuals with factitious or malingered DID may have been influenced by outside individuals. For example, they may be consciously trying to please a therapist or mimicking an individual that they know who has DID. Individuals who feign DID may be especially likely to attend self-help groups, may treat their DID diagnosis as a vital part of their identity, or may have the majority of their social network be DID related. It is important that clinicians be able to distinguish genuine from pseudogenic DID, because treatment will be very different for non-traumagenic presentations of DID. Additionally, a clinician who falsely diagnoses an individual with DID may be risking lawsuits or allegations of inappropriate treatment. On the other hand, if an individual does have DID and is not appropriately diagnosed, their suffering will be prolonged by and may worsen because of the absence of appropriate treatment. Similarly, an individual who has a factitious disorder but is not recognized as such will have a very poor prognosis, making accurate diagnosis vital. It should be noted that not all individuals who falsely assume a label of DID are consciously feigning the disorder. Imitative DID, or a phenomenon in which individuals with cluster B personality disorder profiles who assume the social role of a DID trauma survivor, is not uncommon. Individuals with imitative DID truly believe that they have DID and may have had this false belief reinforced by therapists or other concerned individuals. They may genuinely suffer from dissociative symptoms, though their overall profiles fail to match those of actual DID individuals, particularly in regards to more subtle symptoms. As with deliberate feigners, those with imitative DID often show less shame or conflict regarding their supposed DID diagnosis. Diagnostic instruments such as the SCID-D and MID are capable of distinguishing between genuine and imitative DID when used correctly. So my biggest question here is, why didn't they test LS? Signs of faking dissociative identity disorder. Individuals faking or mimicking DID due to factitious disorder will typically exaggerate symptoms, particularly when observed, lie, blame bad behavior on symptoms, and often show little distress regarding their apparent diagnosis. In contrast, genuine people with DID typically exhibit confusion, distress, and shame regarding their symptoms and history. People who fabricate DID will also often base the portrayal of their supposed alternate identities on stereotypical depictions of the condition from popular culture. It is important to note that these signs should not be used as definitive proof, but rather as red flags that warrant further investigation. Inconsistencies in alter characteristics. Individuals who are faking DID may struggle to maintain consistent alter characteristics. They may provide contradictory information about their alters' names, ages, genders, or behaviors. Lack of amnesia. Amnesia is a common symptom of DID, where individuals have gaps in their memory due to the presence of different alters. Those who are faking may not exhibit significant memory gaps or may conveniently remember events that should have been forgotten. Inconsistent triggers. Individuals with genuine DID may have specific triggers that can cause a switch between alters. Those who are faking may not exhibit consistent triggers or may claim to switch alters without any apparent reason. Exaggerated symptoms. Fakers may exaggerate their symptoms to appear more convincing. They may mimic the behaviors and mannerisms associated with DID without truly experiencing them. Lack of emotional depth. Individuals who are faking may struggle to convey genuine emotions associated with their alters. Their emotional responses may appear shallow or forced. Genuine individuals with DID have often experienced severe trauma. Validate their trauma experiences by expressing empathy and understanding. Fakers may struggle to provide consistent or plausible explanations for their trauma. Here are some quotes from DID sufferers with regard to faking DID. When I discovered I was a system, it hit me like a truck. I was destabilized by several traumatic events, thrown into extreme states of dissociation, interfering with daily functioning, having the overt experience of alters switching for the first time, blacking out, and losing necessary skills. My head was a cacophony of a bunch of people that suddenly wanted a say in my life. Like autistic burnout, DID seems to be caught most often when the system is so destabilized that it suddenly becomes visible. Already you can see the difference between this person's account of her DID and LS's account. LS was having a ball, right? She was being transported to exotic countries by her alters, something that was actually debunked during the investigation. LS had never travelled to these countries that she alleged to be taken to by an alter. And she was not in a confused state at any time, and this is very telling. It is impossible to fake a DID diagnosis since there are years of therapy appointments, neurological scans, and both doctor, therapist, and psychologist approval needed for a diagnosis. Dr. Dorothy Lewis met with LS on a couple of sessions, and remember, there is no evidence that LS has had extensive therapy in the past. All these were lacking in LS. You don't wake up at 40 and discover that you have DID, or even at 16 when she claimed to have started it. DID is typically formed between the ages of 7 to 9, and the sufferer may not know they have it until others point out discrepancies, changes in behavior, memory lapses, etc. And only then, it is through years of therapy that it's diagnosed, and then they learn to live with it. Another example of faking DID would be having impeccable communication between parts when the person has not undergone any psychotherapy at all, when in DID, OSDD1, communication among parts is something that is worked towards because of the dissociative barriers. LS was able to communicate with Maria Sanchez relatively easily and to bring her out shortly after Dr. Lewis asked her to present this particular alter. All of this without having extensive therapy. LS's display of DID was rather pathetic. I think she would have had more success in applying for the role of Samara Morgan in The Ring. She thought that by changing her hairstyle once in a while and display her exorcist impression, twisting her head to the side and twitching, this would prove she had various personalities, but she failed to change her behavior or characteristics along with those hairstyles. If they were truly separate alters, then her demeanor would change. This was very telling for me. Her impression of the horror film The Ring was apparently the only way she knew how to feign insanity. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Dorothy Lewis has caused a lot of controversy with her theories of the origins of criminal behavior, and I have come across her a few times throughout my years of research on serial killers. Her documentary Crazy Not Insane opens with Lewis sitting on a sofa and going through some of her notes with her son. The very same son who sat in on her interviews with LS. You know, the one she lied about on the stand when she said she didn't know who it was, after the prosecuting attorney confronted her with the question, "Who is that person leaving the room?" To which Dr. Lewis blatantly replies, "I don't know." What? She doesn't know her own son? Anyway, in the opening scene of the documentary, they're sitting in the living room of Lewis's home discussing the serial killer, Joseph Paul Franklin. In one part of the documentary, Lewis is describing how she discovered that Arthur Shawcross possibly suffered from temporal lobe seizures. She talks about the typical symptoms and that Shawcross displayed these symptoms. In Lewis's words, he would kill a girl, fall asleep, wake up and see the dead girl and think, "Oops, I must have done it again." And she laughs. She fucking laughs. She even confirms in this documentary that you can't just believe what a patient tells you and that you have to look at all of their records to get corroboration. In order to fully understand why a person becomes violent, we need to know everything about their history. So why didn't she do this with LS? Lewis never even spoke to LS's family members and ignored the fact that there was absolutely no history of DID, but still insisted that LS had DID. Based on what? Shawcross's alter also only ever appeared with Lewis, never with any other psychiatrist. The same thing happened with LS. Another interesting snippet of information is that whilst Lewis was a student, she started dating one of her professors who was much older than she was. They ended up married. Today, that professor might be accused of grooming. That's all I will say about that. I also found it fascinating that she uses the last interview of Ted Bundy in this documentary. Doesn't everybody know that this interview was a farce? Bundy was only telling the interviewer Dr. James Dobson, evangelical author, what he wanted to know to feed his agenda. Not to mention the fact that this was a probable attempt at staying his execution, which was carried out the next day. Lewis, of course, believed that Bundy also had DID, but I'm not convinced. Doesn't DID require severe trauma as a kid? Where was Bundy's severe trauma? This doesn't fit Bundy's background at all. Sure, Bundy had some kind of trauma when he discovered that his sister was actually his mother, and who he thought were his parents ended up being his grandparents. I can imagine that having a profound effect on anybody, but not enough to kill. But Bundy had a lethal cocktail of dispositions. My question is, when did the DID form? He found out the truth about his mother and grandparents much later on, well after the time that DID would normally form. There remains a centuries-long philosophical and scientific debate over nature versus nurture, and I've covered this in my other videos. When deciding people's culpability for their behaviors, and whether people deserve to be labeled as evil or criminal when they kill or harm others, or whether there is more complexity to what leads to crimes. Psychiatrists still struggle amongst themselves to quantify and understand biological determinism versus situational influences when diagnosing and treating their patients. Sometimes this debate causes artificial dichotomies within the field's practitioners, who tend to align their views one way or another for various skewed reasons, including oversimplification, research convenience, self-promotion, and financial incentives. I could go on. Regrettably, despite her extensive experience and prestigious affiliations, Dr. Lewis fails to demonstrate a nuanced understanding of psychiatric taxonomy and forensic diagnosis in the documentary. It attempts to portray her as a misunderstood pioneer who is ahead of her peers in understanding criminality, a depiction open to skepticism. Her belief is that most murderers, including serial killers, suffer from childhood trauma, abuse, and neglect, which in turn causes many of them to develop the controversial diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. She views the murderous and violent parts of these people as a split identity that they possess as a defense mechanism, and thus questions their true culpability in their crimes. While she agrees that most serial killers are a danger to society and must be locked away to protect people from their uncontrollable impulses, she strongly feels the death penalty is cruel and unjust for their behavior, even likening it to burning innocent, misunderstood people accused of witchcraft at the stake. Way to go, Dr. Lewis. The documentary showcases interviews supporting Dr. Lewis's perspective, but these clips often raise more doubts than support for her claims. She seems all too eager to dismiss other realistic possibilities, like secondary gain through an insanity defense, or the frequently manipulative and lying nature of people with severe antisocial personality traits. Overall, she comes across as ready to shoehorn all these people into her core theory of DID, even Ted Bundy, her star interview, and the movie's climax. Her explanation of Bundy, well known to be one of the most prolific and cunning serial killers of all time, as someone who suffered from childhood abuse and DID, seems strained when she argues that his different signatures in letters to his wife and use of different nicknames indicate various split personalities. This was also a point she raised with LS, and we all heard LS say in the interview that she likes to change her name because she hates it. There certainly is a naivety to Lewis, and I identified that in the LS trial. The way she just believed what LS told her with no real corroboration. What was it she would say to the prosecuting attorneys? You can see it. No, Dr. Lewis, you can't see it. Perhaps that sentence should be changed to just you can see it. In some instances, her discussions on neurobiological contributions to criminal behaviour seem to clash with her argument that criminals are not born but made. She mentions a chilling anecdote where Bundy apparently threatened a relative with a set of knives at age 3, an age where one might argue he could not have learned that behaviour from anyone. She insists Bundy's grandfather was abusive, but various family members contradict that story. While acknowledging the impact of childhood abuse and trauma on criminal behaviour, Dr. Lewis tends to oversimplify the relationship between upbringing and behaviour, asserting that all serial killers have a particularly horrendous upbringing and inevitably develop DID. Such trauma and its links to DID are also rare and unique. It isn't a given that everyone with trauma develops anything as extreme as DID, which itself remains a hotly debated diagnosis. Although most psychiatrists agree dissociative behaviour, not necessarily discrete personalities, can be a common defense mechanism and form of avoidance against traumatic memories. It is certainly a leap to say that DID is linked to most serial killers and murderers. If anything, their high frequency of antisocial personality traits posits they would be more likely to feign such personalities, either for actual gain or just for its own sake. For someone who has interviewed and worked with so many criminals, Dr. Lewis seems curiously naive about the frequency and broadness of these severe manipulative behaviours. Her lack of coherent integration of possible genetic or neurobiological factors contributes to a skewed understanding of the complexities involved. While advocating compassion for the complexities shaping criminal behaviour and questioning the morality of the death penalty, her approach risks fostering misunderstanding and confusion about the origins of the criminality she has dedicated her entire career to studying. On November 19th, midway through the trial of Arthur J. Shawcross, Dr. Lewis wrote to Judge Wisner outlining her assertions against the defense lawyers who had hired her. The letter said that, among other things, the lawyers had failed to pursue her suggestions that, in addition to psychiatric problems, Mr. Shawcross may have had physical brain impairments. The brain impairments, she said, could have caused seizures and other symptoms that might in part have caused Mr. Shawcross to commit the murders and could have explained the 45-year-old man's strange behaviour. Dr. Lewis's letter said the defence lawyers failed to get proper neurological experts and tests. She claimed in the letter that the defence lawyers lied to her by repeatedly telling her that neurological work was being prepared. This was in 1986. The exact same thing happened in the LS trial. The exact same strategy, exact same lies. As I said before, this is not just some old little lady with dementia who we should all feel sorry for. It seems this is her MO. Dr. Dorothy Lewis has quite a controversial history in courts of the serial killing type that goes back many years. The defense lawyers from the Shawcross trial unsuccessfully asked the judge to declare a mistrial because they said Lewis had biased the jurors against Mr. Shawcross, and they accused her of sabotage during her testimony. Lewis's answers were frequently long and rambling. The prosecution suggested she had not followed accepted practice when she examined and hypnotized Mr. Shawcross before the trial. What we have to remember here is that Dr. Lewis is a forensic psychiatrist, not a neurologist. She even said herself that, as a psychiatrist, she was not an expert in the brain abnormalities. So why are we even talking about this? On January 27th, 2020, the El Paso County Sheriff's Department was called around 6:55 p.m. and was informed of a runaway child, 11-year-old Ganon Stout. Due to the reporting party, Ganon's stepmother, alluding to a runaway situation, the police response time was longer than it would have been in a typical missing child case. And when they arrived, based on info provided by the present caregiver, they listed Ganon as a runaway, losing critical and valuable time that could have been spent getting leads on this case. It is said that after the first 72 hours, the chances of finding a child are dramatically reduced. Within the first 72 hours, the community was not informed of a missing and possibly endangered child. After 3 days, they finally upgraded Ganon to a missing and endangered person. In the state of Colorado, and in most states, it isn't safe to leave an 11-year-old unsupervised for more than 3 hours. At the 3-hour mark at least, Ganon should have been considered missing and in danger. The law has not, as of yet, been passed. I knew I was going to make a documentary about this case the moment the trial began in April 2023. I had already decided then. It was also a hard one to do, and I had to take many breaks because of the depravity of it. Right from how she treated Ganon and ultimately killed him, to how she behaved during the investigation and trial. What piqued my interest, however, was the not guilty by reason of insanity due to DID. I was curious about where her lawyers were going to go with this. I think they weren't even really sure this was the right way. They kept calling it dissociative identity disorder, as opposed to its correct term, dissociative, without the identity disorder. Dissociation refers to a psychological process involving a temporary disruption in the normal integration of thoughts, feelings, memories, or identity. Disassociation, however, refers to a broader concept that involves a deliberate detachment or distancing from a particular thought, emotion, or behavior, and is more common. They also kept throwing the psychosis in the mix, especially in the closing argument. Was it DID or psychosis? Make up your minds. Having researched true crime and in particular serial killers for 40 plus years, this topic has come up quite a few times, and it is something I'm deeply interested in, including the psychology of it. This doesn't make me an expert as such, but it does mean that I'm certainly learned in the topic. In the words of my own therapist, being on the spectrum and being a trauma victim does give me a certain insight, even expertise through experience, to mental disorders and how they can impact people. There are really not many people who I find disgusting, but when I watch her, she is one of those few people. What I also find interesting is that she always has her head down when clips are playing of her interviews. Does she have a problem listening to herself? Kevin Clark, the intelligence analyst who testified at the end of the trial and who was responsible for the timeline and presenting it to the jury, was interviewed after the trial by Grizzly True Crime, and he says that everything Letecia was doing was an act for the camera and jury. Whenever the camera came on, she would do her little ring impression and bring all her hair down in front of her face. There is one video that really freaked me out, and that's the video showing her attack one of the prison guards. She just looks different and really scary in this video. Sometimes her eyes appear black. Now, I don't know at this point if this is just a pixel thing or shadows and lighting or even just my perception, but it has been known on several occasions when victims who have survived violence or killers or serial killers, they mention that their eyes become black just before they unleash their violence. While I'm not convinced that LS has DID or that she is even insane, by the way, DID does not equal insanity, which is one reason I wanted to see where her attorneys take this. She certainly has a few sandwiches short of a picnic. And let's talk about their star witness, Dr. Dorothy Lewis. I have no doubts that Dr. Lewis was a legend in her time, but watching her testimony in the trial, I began to feel that she was deeply biased. She almost wanted LS to have DID. Her last big case, maybe? Did she want to go out with a bang? Lewis does not know how to behave in a court, even though she claims to have testified dozens of times, but it seems she has a bit of a reputation for this. She continues to answer a question that has already been objected to and sustained. She just can't help herself and babbles just as much as the defendant. Speaking of sandwiches, what really takes the biscuit for me is the fact that she was the only person who diagnosed LS as having DID, but she did not meet up with her and evaluate her until after she had instructed her attorneys to plead guilty by reason of insanity. Let's announce her insane first, and then I'm sure I can find something to throw in the bag with it. One thing I noticed when trying to get information for myself about faking DID is that just by throwing that question out there offends a lot of people, and I get that. Those who really do suffer from DID don't need to be questioned. They have enough to contend with. But unfortunately, it is part of reality that many fake it for whatever reasons. And of course, there are those in between, the people who don't have DID but believe they do. Are they faking? Perhaps they exaggerate their symptoms, but then one must ask, why do they believe it? Why are they exaggerating? I think these people also need a portion of empathy and help.